Some families are remembered for their legacy of honor, innovation, or strength, but in the hidden corners of history, there are families remembered for something far darker, rituals and practices that twist morality, silence the innocent, and echo like a curse across generations. Behind closed doors in the cold streets of Massachusetts, the Putnam family's name became etched in whispers, tied not to triumph, but to horrors that defied the boundaries of human decency. What took place in 1858 within that household is not merely history, it is a nightmare carved into the past. In the year 1858, Massachusetts was a place still lingering in the shadow of its Puritan ancestry, where towns carried a facade of moral uprightness, and families took pride in presenting themselves as models of virtue and respectability. The Putnam family embodied this outward image better than most, holding themselves as devout, educated, and respected figures within their community. They attended church regularly, participated in civic life, and gave the impression of being a family rooted deeply in the traditions of New England piety. To those who looked from the outside, the Putnams were nothing more than another pillar of the tightly woven social fabric that held their town together. But beneath the polished surface, behind the doors of their stately home, an entirely different reality festered, one that would grow into a horror so grotesque that the whispers about them would outlive even their descendants. It was in the contrast between what the public saw and what took place in private that the true terror lay, for no one suspected that a family whose image reflected the moral standards of their day could be capable of something so monstrous. The contradiction was so complete that neighbors dismissed strange sounds and unusual behaviors as eccentricities rather than signs of corruption. Massachusetts in the mid-19th century valued appearances to a dangerous degree, where honor and reputation were held above truth, and where people preferred to protect their community's image rather than expose scandal. The Putnams understood this weakness of their environment all too well, and they exploited it carefully, creating a barrier of respectability so strong that it blinded even the most watchful eyes. They wore fine clothes, carried themselves with dignity, and spoke eloquently when matters of morality or scripture were discussed. Their children were well schooled, their land was well kept, and their family gatherings gave an impression of unity and prosperity. Yet those who looked carefully might have noticed the subtle signs, the fleeting glances of unease in the eyes of certain family members, the way the younger ones seemed to shrink when a particular elder entered the room, or the odd, stifled noises that sometimes escaped the home after nightfall. These small details, ignored or explained away, were the cracks in the mask that concealed their reality. The Putnam family's name was not new to notoriety in Massachusetts. Their lineage traced back to earlier generations who had played pivotal roles in the Salem witch trials of the 17th century, a legacy of suspicion, hysteria, and judgment that still clung to the name. It seemed almost as if the echoes of that dark past had laid the groundwork for the sinister practices that emerged in the 19th century. While their ancestors had wielded the power of fear and religion in public trials, the 1858 Putnams directed that same darkness inward, transforming their household into a private theater of cruelty. The outward shell of Puritan morality was their disguise, but the old family blood carried something much older, something malignant that was never purged from their name. To the outside world, they seemed eager to prove themselves as upright and reformed from the stains of history, but in private, they were bound by the same currents of power, control, and distorted sanctity that had plagued their line for generations. The respectability they maintained became their most effective weapon. In a society where gossip could destroy lives, the Putnams ensured that no one would dare question their behavior too deeply. Even the few who harbored suspicions lacked the courage to voice them, for who would believe that such a seemingly respectable family could harbor such obscenity in their midst? The community preferred ignorance, and the Putnams thrived in that willful blindness. They knew that so long as their appearances were intact, they could continue their practices unchallenged. This duality, the polished, pious family by day and the tormentors within their own walls by night, created an environment where silence and secrecy grew like rot, unseen but poisonous. Those within the household who bore the brunt of the family's hidden life learned quickly that no one would come to their aid. The town's admiration of the Putnams made it unthinkable that anyone would dare accuse them of wrongdoing. Even the rare hints of distress that slipped into public view were reinterpreted as signs of stress, illness, or melancholy. never as cries for help. This created a terrifying isolation, a sense that the family was untouchable and that the suffering of those within their walls would never be acknowledged. For the victims, the respectability of the Putnams became a prison as strong as iron bars, a wall of lies that shielded the truth from ever reaching the ears of those who might have intervened. The facade extended even to the way the family interacted in social settings. At church gatherings, they sang hymns with voices that blended seamlessly into the congregation. At town meetings, they spoke about duty, morality, and the importance of keeping the community strong. They hosted dinners where laughter and stories filled the air, creating the illusion of warmth and harmony. But once those doors closed and the last guest had departed, the masks slipped, and the family's true nature re-emerged. That chasm between public grace and private horror became the defining feature of the Putnam family, and it was this dissonance that made their practices all the more terrifying. It was not simply the acts themselves, but the knowledge that they had perfected the art of hiding them that left such a chilling mark on history. By the time whispers began to circle through the town in the later part of 1858, the Putnams' reputation was so firmly entrenched that many refused to believe the stories, dismissing them as exaggerations or malicious rumors. Yet behind those dismissals lay an undercurrent of unease, an unspoken awareness that something about the family did not quite align with the picture they painted for the world. That tension between denial and suspicion would continue to grow, feeding the legend of the Putnams until the whispers could no longer be ignored. But in 1858, they still held the power, still concealed their horrors beneath the veil of respectability, and still maintained the appearance of a family that represented the best of Massachusetts society, while inside their home they embodied the very worst of human depravity. The Putnam family's reputation in 1858 was not only built upon their wealth and influence, but also wrapped in layers of mystery that reached far beyond the surface of everyday respectability. Whispers had begun to circulate even before the year's most dreadful revelations, stories passed down through older generations that suggested the family was bound by traditions not rooted in piety or morality, but in ritualistic practices inherited from their bloodline. In Massachusetts, where the memory of Salem and its hysteria still echoed in the minds of elders, the Putnam name already carried a shadow. Many saw them as descendants of a family cursed by their role in the witch trials, forever tethered to dark forces and bound by secrets that could never be cleansed by church or community. While no one dared accuse them openly, these generational rumors persisted like embers buried beneath ash, waiting for the slightest wind to spark them back to life. It was said that the Putnams engaged in rituals disguised as family traditions, and though most of the community dismissed such claims as fanciful tales meant to slander an old and powerful lineage, the whispers never completely disappeared. Children who grew up near the Putnam estate told stories of hearing unsettling chants carried on the night air, of glimpses of candlelight flickering through shuttered windows long after the rest of the town had gone to sleep. Servants who briefly worked in the home sometimes left in silence, their eyes averted when questioned about why they abandoned such a well-paying position. These fragments of gossip alone might not have raised suspicion in another family, but with the Putnams, they seemed to fit into a larger, darker narrative. The rituals spoken of were not harmless gatherings, but acts that bound family members into submission, using twisted notions of loyalty and obedience to enforce silence. Generational beliefs within the family seemed to revolve around power over one another, power over outsiders, and a belief that the continuation of their bloodline required acts of control that others would have called monstrous. To the Putnams, what they carried out behind closed doors was not only permitted but necessary. Elders within the family framed their practices as duties, traditions that had to be preserved at all costs, and those born into the household were taught from a young age that resistance was unthinkable. The past was constantly invoked to justify the present, with stories of ancestors who demanded obedience and punishment serving as both threat and warning. This sense of ritual, cloaked in the language of heritage, created an environment where cruelty was not random but systematic, rehearsed and enforced with precision. The rituals themselves blurred the line between punishment, control, and unspeakable acts that exploited the vulnerable. Those subjected to them were told it was for the family's preservation, that their suffering was a necessary sacrifice for the strength of their name. Religious language was twisted into justification, prayers turned into commands, and scripture recited in tones that bore no resemblance to devotion, but rather to domination. Such practices were not performed haphazardly. They followed a disturbing rhythm, as if rehearsed across generations, each repetition embedding the horror more deeply into the family's identity. These acts became not just individual crimes, but collective performances of secrecy, where participation or silence was demanded under threat of punishment worse than the act itself. What made these rituals so sinister was their calculated secrecy. Unlike ordinary violence or scandal, which could be stumbled upon or exposed, the Putnam's practices were shrouded in a deliberate veil. Every family member knew their role, and every role was designed to keep outsiders from ever learning the truth. Fear and loyalty became indistinguishable, ensuring that even those who wished to speak out had no avenue to do so. The very architecture of the home seemed complicit, with rooms that were rarely entered by visitors, doors that creaked closed behind heavy locks, and spaces where the air seemed to carry an unnatural heaviness. For outsiders, the Putnam house was simply another grand Massachusetts estate, but for those inside, it was a stage for horrors dressed as tradition. The belief in ancestral duty gave their actions a ritualistic weight that made them even more difficult to expose. How could one explain to an outsider that the cruelty inflicted within those walls was not seen by the perpetrators as cruelty at all, but as a sacred obligation? This distorted worldview ensured that the family's practices were self-sustaining, passed from one generation to the next with chilling precision. To disobey was to risk excommunication from the family, and for those born into such an insular and controlling household, exile was more terrifying than submission. The fear of losing one's place, of being cast out without protection or identity, trapped many in silence and ensured the cycle continued unbroken. The community, though largely ignorant of what transpired in the Putnam home, could not entirely ignore the aura of unease that surrounded the family. Farmers spoke of strange markings burned into wood near the property, symbols they claimed had no business in a Christian household. Midwives whispered that certain births in the family were accompanied by unusual demands or rituals, practices that bore no resemblance to normal tradition. These were never openly discussed in town halls or church sermons, but they lingered in the shadows of conversation, reinforcing the sense that something about the Putnams was deeply unnatural. Still, the respectability of their public image shielded them from scrutiny, and so the rituals continued, unchallenged and uninterrupted, year after year. By 1858, these generational rumors had coalesced into a dark reputation, unspoken yet widely understood. The Putnams were not a family to be questioned too deeply, nor a household to be intruded upon without invitation. Their history, their legacy, and their whispered practices all merged into a narrative that frightened even the boldest of neighbors. Yet the truth of what they carried out within their walls was darker than rumor alone could ever capture, for the rituals were not simply symbolic, but acts of horror that violated every boundary of decency. And still, they persisted, carried forward with the same certainty as any family tradition, a grotesque inheritance that bound each generation tighter to the shadows of the one before. The Putnam household in 1858 was a place where silence was not simply expected, but demanded, where victims existed in a world of constant fear, knowing that even the smallest act of resistance or whisper of truth would invite punishment that seemed endless. Women and children bore the greatest weight of this silence, their lives consumed by the oppressive control of family elders who cloaked their actions beneath the guise of authority and tradition. Within those walls, suffering was not accidental but engineered, a calculated system in which terror became the foundation of obedience. For the women, their voices were stripped away, and their bodies became battlegrounds, while the children grew up in a state of confusion, unable to separate love from control, devotion from dread. Each day unfolded like a ritual of subjugation, where the language of loyalty was poisoned by coercion, and the sanctity of family was replaced by a distorted form of ownership. Those subjected to these practices were reminded constantly that their pain was a burden they must carry for the good of the family. What should have been nurturing relationships between parents and children, between siblings, between elders and the young, became twisted into roles defined by dominance and submission. The youngest members learned quickly that their safety depended on compliance, that their cries or objections would only lead to harsher punishments or crueler humiliations. For the women, any trace of autonomy was systematically dismantled, leaving them dependent on the very people who orchestrated their suffering. This forced loyalty created an environment where breaking free was not even imagined, for the notion of escape was overshadowed by fear of what would follow. Religious manipulation became one of the most insidious tools of control within the Putnam family. Scripture, twisted and misapplied, was used to justify the silence of victims, turning sacred words into instruments of fear. Passages that spoke of obedience and submission were recited to remind women and children of their supposed duty, while the concept of sin was wielded as a weapon to convince them that resistance would bring divine punishment. Prayer became an instrument of domination, not comfort, as elders forced victims to participate in recitations that bound them further into silence. To speak against the family was equated with speaking against God, creating a psychological prison even stronger than the physical one. The blending of piety and cruelty blurred the line between faith and fear so thoroughly that victims could no longer trust in the very beliefs that should have offered them solace. The acts themselves were designed not only to harm but to fracture the spirit of those subjected to them. Every violation was layered with reminders of power, every assault a reinforcement of control. Victims were made to feel complicit in their suffering, convinced that their silence was a moral duty and that their pain served some higher purpose. This manipulation turned inward, creating guilt where there should have been none, shame where there should have been dignity. The cruelty was not only physical but psychological, ensuring that even when the body healed, the mind remained shackled. The victims lived in constant tension, never knowing when the next act of horror would be demanded of them, their days marked by the unpredictability of cruelty masquerading as order. Whispers of what occurred within the household occasionally reached the ears of outsiders, carried in fragments by those too broken to speak directly. A young servant girl dismissed from service muttered incoherent phrases about locked rooms and muffled cries, but was dismissed as hysterical. A woman who left the family property weeping was explained away as suffering from melancholy, an affliction all too common among women in that era, rather than acknowledged as someone escaping torment. The community's willingness to overlook such signs only deepened the isolation of the victims, confirming to them that no help would come from beyond the walls of the estate. Their silence was reinforced not only by the family's threats, but by the indifference of a society that preferred to look away. The children of the household bore the cruelest confusion, raised in a world where affection was interwoven with exploitation, where those who were meant to nurture them were instead the very sources of their fear. Their understanding of family bonds became corrupted, leaving them unable to distinguish between love and coercion. Some were too young to remember a time before the suffering, which made obedience seem like the natural order of life. Others, as they grew older, recognized the injustice of their circumstances, but were trapped by the futility of speaking out. They watched as women were silenced, as siblings were broken, and they internalized the truth that survival depended on submission. This generational cycle ensured that trauma was not only inflicted but inherited, passed down like a curse that bound each new life to the horrors of the family's past. Even within the household, fear was not uniform, but carefully distributed to pit victims against one another. Those who obeyed without question were given small mercies, privileges that set them apart from those who resisted. This strategy sowed mistrust, preventing unity among the oppressed and ensuring that silence was maintained through suspicion as much as through terror. A woman who hesitated might find herself isolated, blamed by others who feared her resistance would bring harsher punishment upon them all. A child who cried too loudly could be scorned by siblings desperate to maintain the fragile illusion of safety. In this way, the victims themselves were turned into tools of control, bound not only by the cruelty of their oppressors, but by the fractured loyalties that fear created among them. The effect of this silence rippled outward, shaping not only the daily existence of those within the Putnam home, but their very identities. Women who might have once dreamed of independent lives were reduced to shadows of themselves, their spirits broken under the weight of constant violation. Children grew into adults carrying scars too deep to name, their voices stolen before they could ever find them. The silence became so complete that it enveloped everything, a suffocating presence that hung over the estate like a fog, erasing hope and ensuring that the horrors endured would remain buried within the family's walls. It was not simply that victims were silenced, it was that they were convinced their silence was inevitable, unchangeable, ordained by forces both human and divine. leaving them with no refuge and no escape from the relentless shadow of the Putnam family. The horrors that took place within the Putnam household did not remain entirely sealed behind the heavy doors of their estate. In Massachusetts, a place where communities were tightly knit and people noticed the smallest of details in their neighbors' lives, strange occurrences surrounding the family inevitably sparked whispers that spread quietly through the town. Neighbors who passed the estate late at night claimed to have seen shadows moving unnaturally behind curtained windows, figures pacing in ways that suggested unrest rather than domestic peace. Some spoke of hearing muffled cries carried on the wind, though these sounds were quickly dismissed as the noises of animals or the product of imagination. Yet the more people dismissed, the more the whispers grew, for unease always has a way of seeping into conversation, clinging to the edges of daily life until it becomes impossible to ignore. Children in the village played games of daring one another to approach the Putnam property after dark, their innocent bravado masking a deep fear that something was not right about the family who lived there. They told stories of lights that never extinguished, of rituals carried out in secret, and of rooms that seemed to hold a life of their own. Farmers working the fields nearby sometimes returned home with uneasy tales of symbols scratched into wood or stone, markings that did not belong to natural wear. The whispers took on lives of their own, transformed into folklore that blended fear with speculation, but underneath the exaggerations there lingered a kernel of truth that gave the rumors their sharp edge. Something about the Putnams did not fit within the ordinary rhythms of town life, and while people did not want to accuse a family of such influence directly, they could not ignore the sense of dread that seemed to accompany their name. Disappearances only deepened that dread. Servants employed in the household sometimes vanished without explanation, their departures explained away by the family as sudden illnesses, relocations, or disagreements. Yet no letters ever arrived from these supposed new destinations, no confirmations of their safety were ever seen, and their absence remained a hollow wound in the community. Families who lost daughters or nieces to service in the Putnam home occasionally raised questions, but these were quickly quieted by the combined force of the Putnams' wealth, reputation, and insistence on privacy. Mothers whispered to their children to avoid taking work there, yet the lure of steady pay often outweighed the fear, and so the cycle continued, each new disappearance folded into the uneasy lore of the family. The traumas inflicted within the household rippled outward in subtler ways as well. Women who managed to leave the estate carried with them a silence heavy with secrets. They returned to the community pale and withdrawn, their voices hesitant, their bodies marked with signs they could not explain. Some never married, unable to trust intimacy again, while others lived lives of nervous restraint, always glancing over their shoulders as though the shadow of the Putnams still pursued them. Children who grew old enough to be sent away from the home often arrived in other towns carrying strange behaviors, nervous tics, sudden outbursts of fear, or an unsettling quiet that unnerved those around them. Though no one dared voice accusations outright, the community could not avoid noticing that something about those connected to the family was profoundly wrong. The church, usually the center of order and morality in such towns, proved powerless to address the situation. Ministers praised the Putnams in sermons, citing their donations and regular attendance as evidence of their piety. This public recognition made the rumors seem all the more outlandish, as though to believe them was to accuse not only the family but also the very institution that embraced them. Yet beneath the surface, even the ministers harbored doubts, for they too had noticed the way certain family members avoided eye contact during prayers, the way children flinched at sudden noises, the way women's voices trembled when called upon to speak. These details were never named aloud, but they lingered in the silence after services, becoming part of the unspoken knowledge that gnawed at the town like rot beneath polished wood. Over time, the weight of these whispers created a divide in the community. Some defended the Putnams fiercely, insisting that the family's prominence made them natural targets for envy and slander. Others, though unwilling to accuse directly, admitted unease that could not be shaken. This tension manifested in quiet arguments behind closed doors, in wary glances exchanged at markets, in the hushed tones of conversations that ended abruptly when outsiders entered the room. The Putnam name had become a paradox, a symbol of respect and stability on the surface, yet beneath that veneer, a source of anxiety and fear. The more people tried to suppress the rumors, the more power they seemed to gain, until the family's presence loomed larger than life. Their estate a silent monument to everything unspoken. Children who grew up hearing these whispers carried the fear into adulthood, passing it on to the next generation as stories meant to warn and unsettle. By then, the details had blurred, and the horrors were half-remembered tales, but the effect was the same. No one could shake the impression that the Putnam's legacy was built on foundations of pain and secrecy. The rumors became part of the community's identity, an undercurrent of dread that colored how people spoke of their own history. Even those who had never seen the estate firsthand claimed to know someone who had, and their stories painted pictures of a household ruled not by love or faith, but by control and fear. What made the whispers so powerful was that they were not born from nothing. Behind every exaggerated tale of midnight rituals or strange lights lay the reality of trauma, buried but not forgotten. The suffering of the victims could not be entirely hidden, no matter how carefully the family tried to control appearances. It leaked into the community in subtle ways, through broken lives, silent tears, and the absence of those who vanished without explanation. Each of these fragments added weight to the growing unease, until the community itself carried the burden of the family's darkness. In this way, the Putnam horrors extended far beyond their household, becoming a wound in the town's collective memory, a presence that lingered in every whisper, every suspicious glance, every uneasy silence that followed the mere mention of their name. By the time fragments of truth about the Putnam family began to surface, the reality of their practices was so deeply entangled with secrecy and silence that no single account could capture the full horror. The exposure came not in the form of a dramatic confession or a single piece of irrefutable evidence, but through scattered records, half-forgotten testimonies, and fragments of documents that were never meant to be seen by the public. Parish records hinted at sudden illnesses that did not align with medical understanding. Coroner notes mentioned injuries that could not be explained by accidents, and letters exchanged between distant relatives contained cryptic warnings that spoke of shame within the family name. Each piece was like a shard of glass, incomplete on its own, but cutting enough to suggest a larger, shattered truth that lay hidden beneath. The fragmented nature of the evidence was not accidental. The Putnams had the resources and influence to suppress anything that might reveal the reality of their home. Official documents were altered, court cases quietly dismissed, and rumors redirected to seem like petty slander. Yet in the shadows, stories survived through oral traditions, passed down in whispers from those who had glimpsed the truth but dared not record it openly. Women who had escaped the household shared their memories in hushed tones with trusted friends, careful never to write anything that could be traced back to them. Children who had grown into adults carried their scars in silence, revealing fragments of their suffering only in moments of weakness, where tears spoke more than words could ever manage. These fragments, though incomplete, became the threads that later historians, storytellers, and families pieced together into a chilling tapestry of generational corruption. The suppression of records meant that much of what was known about the Putnams came from inconsistencies: a baptismal entry without a corresponding death record, a will that omitted the names of certain heirs without explanation, or a census that listed servants who seemed to vanish from the household without trace. All of these gaps told a story louder than any direct accusation. These inconsistencies raised questions that could not easily be silenced, though those in power tried desperately to do so. For every official denial, there remained the quiet knowledge of those who had seen too much, who knew the difference between gossip and truth, but lacked the power to prove it. Oral histories became the most enduring carriers of the family's darkness. Mothers warned daughters never to marry into the Putnam line, while old men told cautionary tales around firesides of the cursed household that had once stood proud in Massachusetts. These stories shifted with each retelling, details exaggerated or softened depending on the teller, yet the core of the narrative remained the same: that the Putnams had practiced acts too horrific to name, acts that brought shame not only on themselves, but on the community that allowed them to persist. In this way, even as official records disappeared or were destroyed, the memory of the family's horrors lived on, carried by voices determined not to let the truth vanish completely. Some documents that did survive bore marks of deliberate concealment. Pages were torn, lines blackened, and names erased, as though obliterating words could erase the acts themselves. But these very attempts at censorship betrayed the truth more than silence ever could, for they hinted at knowledge too dangerous to remain unaltered. In certain archives, researchers later found references to indecencies and domestic scandals, carefully phrased to avoid specifics, yet clearly pointing towards something far darker than ordinary quarrels. Each vague phrase suggested a weight that could not be put into writing, as though even the act of describing it was forbidden. This careful dance around the truth was itself a testimony, a silent acknowledgement that what occurred was beyond the limits of acceptable speech. For the community, the partial exposure of the Putnam's secrets created a legacy of shame that stretched far beyond the family's fall. Neighbors who had ignored the whispers now found themselves complicit, burdened by the knowledge that they had turned away from signs that might have saved lives. Churches that had praised the family were forced into uneasy silence, unwilling to confront the fact that piety had been used as a shield for atrocity. Generations later, the name Putnam was still spoken with caution, not only because of what the family had done, but because of what the community had failed to prevent. This shared guilt ensured that the memory of their practices was preserved, even if in incomplete and distorted form. The fragmented records also created an air of mystery that magnified the horror. Because no single account revealed everything, each gap in the story invited speculation, and speculation often leaned toward the worst possibilities. Historians searching for clarity encountered only shadows, piecing together events from traces that suggested far more than they revealed. This lack of certainty allowed the legend to grow, for in the absence of complete truth, the imagination filled in the blanks with visions of unspeakable cruelty. The result was a legacy that was both historical and folkloric, a tale grounded in fact but amplified by the unease of what could never be fully known. The endurance of these stories into later generations ensured that the Putnam family's name was never entirely cleansed. Children in Massachusetts grew up hearing cautionary tales of the family, tales that blurred the line between superstition and history, but carried an undeniable weight of warning. Even as the physical evidence of their estate crumbled and disappeared, the memory of their acts lingered in the minds of those who came after, shaping how the community remembered its past. The family's attempts to erase their own history had the opposite effect, for by leaving only fragments, they created a puzzle too terrible to ignore, a legacy that demanded retelling precisely because it could never be fully understood. Thus, the story of the Putnams survived not through the clarity of official records, but through the persistence of memory, whispered tales, and the haunting absence of truth where truth should have been. It was this absence that gave their story its lasting power, ensuring that their name became synonymous not with respectability or influence, but with a darkness that could never be fully erased. A reminder that the most horrific legacies are often the ones buried deepest, left to fester in silence until they resurface in the echoes of history.